Neunzehn has a weird distinction. Because the title is the number 19 in German, it is the only Famicom or Disk System game whose title begins with the Japanese character Nu. So if you're building your Famicom alphabet, you have to get this one. Though I guess I should mention that SoftPro misspelled the title, or maybe they were using an old localization guide, since Neunzehn should really start with Ne, N-E. But why is the title in German when the box depicts what looks to be a classical theme? Well, there's a story there. And to explain it, I kind of have to explain wargaming. Before there were video games, there were war games. That is to say, board games that were designed to represent the ebb and flow of a real battle. And it's hard to understate the significance of wargaming as a hobby to the nerds who are around in the early days of computing. You can see the parallels with programming. Wargames had complicated rule sets intended to simulate reality a bit, but these rules could easily be laid out in a procedural way. When computer gaming became a thing, wargames were one of the big genres in those early days. Dungeons & Dragons, and thus the entire role-playing genre, was created as a rules extension for a wargame. So even though these days wargames are a very tiny genre on computers and consoles, where even the popular strategy games are generally far more abstracted, the influence of those wargames still runs deep. And the very first wargame, the very first time that someone attempted to reasonably model a battle on a tabletop, was Kriegsspiel, which, if you can parse your German compound words, would be warplay. Kriegsspiel was created in the 19th century to give Prussian officers a way to train tactics without having to get a whole bunch of guys with guns lined up on a field. Now, because this was a bunch of military officers wandering around with no clue what they were doing, there's literally hundreds of variations that they used in order to simulate different aspects of a battle. But there were certain structures that were overwhelmingly common. One was that everyone wrote down the orders that they were giving to their army and handed those over to a referee who would then resolve all of those orders simultaneously. You could order your troops to move and they could go a certain distance depending on the terrain, tell them to fire their guns in a particular direction, or perhaps stand and fight hand to hand. And in some variations of Kriegsspiel, they had to account for the exhaustion of their army and sometimes let their men rest. And that brings me back to Neunzehn. Because of the hobby's German roots, and these tie more to the Napoleonic Wars rather than World War II, wargames often have a lot of superfluous German in them. And besides, Neunzehn is very heavily based on Kriegsspiel, but not all of it. The plot of the game is that 4 legendary heroes have been tasked with getting an orb left behind by the 19 Olympian gods. That's where the 19 comes from. And to do this, the 4 heroes each get an army, 1/4 of the surface of a continent, and decide to try to kill each other. Don't worry about that orb, it never shows up anywhere other than the introduction. Your first task is to pick a hero. While there aren't distinct units, every hero's soldier is slightly different. Movement speed and attack arcs vary for all of them. Simone's forest troops are considered to be the average ones, while Darius's mountain troops have much stronger melee ability. Tullis's desert troops are great at shooting, plus don't suffer a penalty while moving on sand, and Sonia's water army moves twice as fast as everyone else. Because of the way the game works, the Red Mountain Army is probably the easiest ones to use. With your hero selected, it's time to battle. And before we actually get into the Kriegsspiel stuff, we have a map of the continent where everyone has a fortress in the corner and a handful of armies that they move around. In this segment, everyone takes turns. Armies can only move 1 square, and if you press start, you'll end your turn prematurely. You can replenish your armies by choosing to not move everyone, though there is a maximum number of armies you can have on the field at once. When 2 computer-controlled armies run into each other, well, they just bounce off and don't do anything. When an army you control collides with a computer-controlled opponent, that's when the battle begins. And those individual battles are where Neunzehn becomes just like Kriegsspiel. Armies only have 3 soldiers in them when they're generated, and when they fight, you give orders to all 3 of your troops, while simultaneously your opponent has given orders to all of their troops, and then once the last order is given, everyone moves. There are 4 different commands you can give each soldier. The first one is to move, but movement is a little bit funny. What direction they're facing matters a lot, and even though they're squares, you're moving on a field of hexagons. So when you're giving orders, you press left and right to rotate 60 degrees, pressing up will move forward, and pressing back will retreat. Moving backward costs an extra movement point, as does entering some difficult terrain. You can't give orders to your soldiers to occupy the same hex, but it is possible to move into hexes that contain enemy soldiers. The next order is to shoot and then move. You always fire first, and then move using reduced movement points. When you're shooting, there's a dot, and you can freely rotate that. Well, I say freely, but there's firing arcs in this game. In other words, a soldier has a certain range of motion that they can shoot through. With the yellow soldiers, that arc is much bigger. So if you want to use ranged attacks, or want to avoid ranged attacks, it'll help to keep in mind how you're orientated. But because you have free movement in that firing arc, you don't have to be lined up in a straight line to shoot someone. Shots have limited range, can get blocked by terrain, and they take time to get to their target, so enemies could get out of the way. The next option is to fight someone with your swords, and here you can choose to freely move or swing your weapon. Hitting the A button will stay in place for movement, and with this command it also acts as an attack. That will cover the hexes in front of you, but once again, there's firing arcs, and for the Red Army, they do a wider swing than everyone else. For this one, you're not limited to attacking first and then moving. You can move up and attack, or stay in one place and attack repeatedly. You've got a lot more flexibility. All 3 of those commands take up some of the unit's energy, and they can recover that by staying in place and resting. Though I think that really only comes into play if you make them fight repeatedly. When the battle's over, you're given the opportunity to replay, and that'll just show you all of the action that occurred on the battlefield. If you do manage to win multiple battles with a single unit, then those soldiers will get promoted to be much stronger. Of course, if you've lost troops in this process, then you could easily wind up with an army consisting of 1 strong soldier facing down armies that still have all 3 men. If you stick with it, eventually you'll wipe out your opponents, take their castles, and then win. There's no difficulty settings here, no other maps to play. This is it. Which makes a kind of sense considering it is a board game. Naturally, Noinzine is not a popular game in Japan, though it does seem to have a small cult following, mainly from people who like the distinctive combat system. That combat system, by the way, is going to get reused. SoftPro makes another Disk System game using it, called Fairy Tale, that we'll see in a little while. My own feelings here are that it doesn't really work. The battlefield maps in Noinzine are either way too large or have way too few units on them, and they really shouldn't have allowed people to charge through enemy units with their troops. Usually in this kind of game, the way that gets resolved is it just breaks their movement right there. Because of the way that the map is scaled, and how movement has to be enhanced for that, ranged attacks wind up getting weakened. There are some really good ideas here, it's just the game design isn't well balanced, and I don't just mean how strong each side is. This is a game that needed a little bit more thought in how to shape it. Maybe they could have taken a few more things from the old Kriegspiel games.